I will call this video Propaganda 101 to describe and explain the science behind political propaganda. It's worth unpacking this concept because propaganda is a word used seemingly with ever greater frequency. Usually, it's used to smear, censor, and cancel those with opposing views. But this is a very propagandistic use of the word propaganda because the way to counter propaganda is opening up, having rational discussions and not using what is effectively propaganda techniques to undermine the exchange of rational arguments. We see that propaganda has a clear meaning, and as I said, there's a science behind propaganda, very exact science actually. And this will therefore be an introduction towards this science. So propaganda is commonly associated now with lying or disinformation or repeating the narratives even of opposing sides. However, this implies that you appeal to the rational faculties of the audience to deceive them. But this is not a good definition of propaganda. Propaganda is the science of manipulating the audience by appealing to the irrational aspects of human nature, the subconsciousness. Because we know that the individual can be rational. However, it is also true that human beings act on instincts. And one of the strongest instincts in human nature is the need to adjust to the group. Because human beings organize in groups, we have for thousands of years. We organize in groups for common meaning, common security. This is why we naturally gravitate towards groupings such as the family, nation, religious groups. This is a very core instinct in human nature, and it also requires us to exactly adjust to the group around us. So this is a key issue in human nature. We're rational individuals, but we're also irrational animals to some extent, organizing into groups. And none other than Sigmund Freud introduced the science of group psychology. He also recognized that while the individual is rational, in a group setting, the individual loses its sense of individuality. It becomes easily persuaded, emotional, impulsive. The individual suppresses rational thought and moral restraints. This is what the group psychology does to the rational individual. And there's ways to manipulate the group psychology. But we also see that participation in groups, it forms a collective group consciousness. Social instincts or herd instincts, tribal instincts, these are common themes. And your need to adapt to the group, it really overwhelms rational considerations. And this was why Freud argued that the group has no critical faculty. It only adapts to the group. So in other words, what an individual would never do for moral restraints or rational consideration, he would be more inclined to do if it's an entire group activity. If the rest of the group does it, he will then be instinctively aligned with the group, and he will be informed more by emotions as opposed to anything rational. Now, if you can manipulate this unconscious, the group psychology, then you do not need to appeal to the rational aspect of human nature at all. So let's just delve into who wrote most of the initial literature on political propaganda. And the foundational literature on political propaganda was developed more than a century ago by Edward Bernays, who happened to be the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Indeed, Edward Bernays developed political propaganda based on the work of his uncle. That is, how do you manipulate the group psychology and irrational aspects of human nature? Edward Bernays assisted in convincing the American public to join the First World War under slogans that conveyed greater meaning for the group, such as the war to end all wars, and the war to make the world safe for democracy. Again, this sounds like marketing, as if he's selling a product, and to a large extent, that's what political propaganda is the marketing of politics. Indeed, marketing and political propaganda does largely the same things. They sell ideas and feelings for the group. Uh, for example, one doesn't buy a car because of the utilities always. When they sell the car, they sell it based on status, sex, and other appeals. And politics is often done the same. So, for example, freedom is a key way of selling war. And this is also a key theme in political propaganda. If you want to make human beings do some of the worst thing in human nature, you have to appeal to what's best in human nature. So you appeal to freedom, democracy, liberty, and this is how you get people engaged in wars. So Edward Bernays, he was involved in both marketing and political propaganda. In marketing, he led a campaign of how to get women to smoke because smoking wasn't seen as being very feminine, and it was mostly men who smoked. So he therefore linked the feminine and emancipating women by smoking cigarettes. He launched the Torches of Freedom campaign. That is when a woman lighted up her cigarette. It wasn't simply a nicotine delivery system. No, it was a sign of empowering women. So he took what was a masculine product and made it acceptable to women as well. Now, Bernays used the same marketing principles for politics, as he was also hired by the United Fruit Company when the government of Guatemala introduced new labor laws to protect workers. And this, of course, undermined profitability. So Bernays convinced the American public that Jacobo Arbenz, the president of Guatemala, who was actually a liberal capitalist, that he was actually a communist, threatening fundamental freedom. So after Bernays was able to sway the American public opinion with deception, Eisenhower intervened and toppled the government under the auspices of fighting communism and defending freedom. So you're not toppling a government to control its resources. No, you're actually helping the people gain freedom. So this is how propaganda effectively is the marketing of politics. And just to point out the importance of Edward Bernays, not just that he was the nephew building on the work of his uncle, Freud. In Germany, the propaganda minister of Hitler, Goebbels, also recognized that most of his ideas on political propaganda came from Edward Bernays. So propaganda, it didn't come out of nowhere. Propaganda filled a demand because at the turn of the century, the world had become much more complex, and it became unrealistic that people, even informed politicians, should be fully informed of everything happening around in all corners of the world, economics, social, political issues. So it's simply too much to ask. So what they need to manage the population is heuristics or mental shortcuts. And we see how this works today. If the United States is bombing Yemen today, well, you don't really know where to find it on a map. You don't need to know any of the history or the background. Yet for some reason, you do know exactly what this is about. You know who's on the right side and who is on the wrong side. And you know this because we, the in-group who is attacking, are liberal democracies. We're good. Our objective is to advance freedom, democracy, human rights. Meanwhile, the opponents are terrorists, they're aggressive, and they hate us. So if you accept the premise that one side is good and the other side is bad, you buy into the stereotype, then what does objective reality actually mean? Who attacks who first? Who's threatening whom? What did each side actually say and do? This kind of disappears into the background. And this is where the group psychology enters. Again, it's a very powerful aspect in human nature. We divide people into the in-group, who are we, and the out-group, the opponents, the other. And the reason why this is such a strong instinct is because if we want to survive over the thousands of years, we have to adjust to the in-group. And if you can manipulate then the stereotypes of the in-group and out-group, then again, objective reality no longer really matters. Because if we invade someone, it's to advance freedom, to help the people we invade. Yet if our opponents invade, it's the exact opposite. It's to destroy freedom. It's to enslave and advance empire. So whenever you hear rhetoric of politics simply being framed in the language of good versus evil, then you know there's political propaganda at play. For the West, our political propaganda is now organized around liberal democracies versus autocracies. It didn't always used to be this. It used to be civilized versus the barbarians. During the Cold War, it was less ethnic and more ideological. It was everything had to be seen through the prism of capitalism versus communism, freedom versus slavery. After the Cold War, it was recast again as a struggle of liberal democracy versus autocracies. This is a placeholder for saying goodies versus baddies. And of course, there's some truth. There is the Western democracies tend to be more liberal democratic than their opponents. Yet the idea that this is what explains all the conflicts in the world is simply absurd. Uh, it's oversimplifies and dumbs down complexities, and it does this for a very good reason, to say that one side is good and the other side is evil. So when political leaders speak solely about our values and the belligerent intentions of our adversaries, you also know there's propaganda at play. Indeed, when was the last time any of our politicians, or journalists for that matter, even discussed the issue of competing security concerns? All countries have different security concerns. We often end up in security competition. This is how you would promote peace. You would have mutual understanding for what the other side is worried about. You would try not to enhance your security at the expense of their security, and you would find common solutions for a common peace. But again, when was the last time any of our politicians or journalists even dared to discuss what are the security concerns and interests of Russia or China or Iran? They no longer do this. They only explain why they are bad and why they conflict with our good values. We also see other minor tactics being used. So, for example, with the war in Ukraine, the key themes which are repeated over and over again is it was an unprovoked invasion, it was a full-scale invasion. These claims are very easy to disprove if we are having a rational discussion with arguments. But we are not. Indeed, we see that the human mind, the way we learn, it tends to confuse what is familiar with what is real. So if you just repeat it over and over again, every news article, every politician open up with it, then after a while, it sounds true, because simply this is the way human beings absorb information and learn. Now, we also know that propaganda itself has been propagandized. That is, if we look originally, all the main or original scholars on propaganda recognized that democracies are actually more dependent on on propaganda, because when the voting rights were expanded, and indeed democracy entails that sovereignty is transferred to the people, suddenly it matters a lot more how to manage the crowd. If you're an actual autocracy, you don't have to take into account the public to the same extent, then it's less demand on propaganda. And this is an interesting development or thing to consider, because even Edward Bernays recognized democracies will be more dependent on propaganda. So how can it be that that it's almost accepted as truism that liberal democracies don't do propaganda? This is only for authoritarian states. Well, even though the initial propagandists referred to propaganda as a respectable profession, before World War I, it had to be changed because the Germans, they sullied the name of propaganda. Their propaganda in the war created too many negative connotations. So, as we do often in propaganda, you manipulate the language. And Edward Bernays had a key role in this. He rebranded it as public relations. And again, that's what we do. The in-group, which is good, does public relations. The out-group, the other side, they do propaganda. And if we um, manipulate the society of other countries, we engage civil society. We are engaging in democracy. If our opponents do the exact same thing, then it's hybrid warfare. So you create two sets of language to avoid any comparison between the in-group and the out-group. Now, just to finish off, Walter Lippmann, he changed his mind on propaganda. He also had a key role in developing the initial literature on political propaganda. And but he changed his mind because of the benefits versus the disadvantages. Now, he also recognized that propaganda was largely about framing the world or conflict as a struggle between good and evil. And he recognized that the benefit of this, or the good thing about propaganda, is that it enables you to mobilize public support for a conflict. If you tell your people who might not want a war, such as the Americans during World War I, that this is a struggle between freedom and slavery. If we just do this war, it will end all wars. It will make the world safe for democracies. Then it's easier to get public support for war. Again, you sell it by appealing to the best in human nature. However, Walter Lippmann did change his mind because he argued while propaganda is great for making war, it's terrible for making peace. Because once a workable peace was available or attainable, then it would become impossible. Because he made the point, how can you compromise with evil? If you convinced your public that you're fighting an evil opponent, uh, how can you have a workable peace? And this is why the propaganda is great for mobilizing the public for war. But once it's a need to get the war to an end, perhaps a peaceful solution is available, or simply we're losing the war, then a workable peace is no longer attainable. And what better description is there for our current war in Ukraine?